The Theater History Podcast is supported by HowlRound, a knowledge commons by and for the theater community. It's available on iTunes and howlround.com.
Hi, and welcome to the Theater History Podcast. I'm Mike Leager. Many of us probably developed our love for theater by watching or participating in so-called amateur theater. Community theaters, school productions, any performance in which the participants aren't professionals. Important as amateur theater is, it doesn't get a lot of scholarly attention. David Coates is hoping to change that. He's currently in the final weeks of working on a thesis that explores the history of amateur theatricals in the century preceding the First World War. He's a part-time doctoral candidate at the University of Warwick and has served in a number of positions in the International Federation for Theatre Research, the Theatre and Performance Research Association, and the Society for Theatre Research. David, thank you so much for joining us.
And thank you for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to talking about my research for you.
So when you talk about amateur theater, what do you mean by that term, and what time period are you looking at?
So let's go with the time period first of all. So I'm looking at the long 19th century, which I've taken as from 1789 to 1914. And there are clear reasons for taking that. The start of the period, we're starting to see amateur theatre changing. Before that, it was almost purely an aristocratic sort of performance form. But we start to see the lower classes taking on amateur theatricals as part of their sort of culture. It starts to move from the domestic space out into more public spaces, so into the public realm. So you start to see the first amateur clubs and societies in this period. And then by the end of the 19th century, you've got the first umbrella organizations that have developed. So the end marker, 1914, by that point, one of the first networks, the umbrella organizations, has already been set up. That was NODA, the National Operatic and Dramatic Association, which was in 1899. And there's ample evidence from all sorts of places that suggest that, like many other things, after the First World War, things were very different, and amateur theatre was very different. It seems that the middle classes had taken a hold of amateur theatre after the First World War. Before that, it was still sort of seen as an aristocratic form. Even though middle classes throughout the 19th century had clearly started getting involved, they still seem to have some sort of a hold on it. But there's several pieces of evidence that suggest that after the war ended, amateur theatricals were sort of becoming more democratized. So, for example, I've got a quote here from Harley Granville Barker, who said in 1934, quote, "After the war came the amateur dramatic movement, quite unlike the old pre-war private theatricals, not a parasite upon the professional theatre, and essentially a democratic movement." So, it seems like something changed in that time period. The first part of your question, what do you mean by amateur theatre? Well, that in itself is quite tricky. Amateur theatre in this period isn't easy to define. Michael Dobson, who's written about Shakespeare and amateur performance, he said that you couldn't really have amateur theatre until a professional theatre was established, and a theatre wasn't really seen as a profession until the end of the 18th, early 19th century. And that's when you start to see the word amateur being used alongside these theatricals. So, I mean, the easiest way to describe it is, this is a series of non-professional performers that have had no training. Generally, they aren't paid for these performances. These are sort of generalizations, but largely it's along these lines. And yeah, they're getting involved in performances at home or in community spaces or whatever else. In a sense, I'm looking at amateur theatre as we see it today almost, but in a much earlier period.
Yeah, and when you started researching this topic, you've written that you sort of thought, well, this is going to be a niche subject. There's not going to be that much material. I'll really have to kind of look hard to find stuff. I take it that's not the case anymore.
That's right. Yeah, so it started out, I started working on this thesis looking at private theatricals in country houses. When I began, my first project was looking specifically at Chatsworth House in Derbyshire, which I'm sure we'll talk about more later on. And I remember going to the archivists and saying at Chatsworth, look, I need to write an MA thesis on this. I need 40,000 words. And they said, you will never find that, that there isn't material here. But once I started looking at Chatsworth, it was very clear that there was ample evidence. It was just that it had never been privileged. It had always been sort of pushed aside, or it was there but hidden away in other collections or whatever. I remember going to Chatsworth and looking through the household accounts, and you could find things in there relating to the theatre and developments in the theatre, payments for costumiers and so on. There were then accompanying invoices that recorded more about those payments. You then go to, the newspapers where the Chatsworth theatricals were covered vast amounts in the newspapers, locally and nationally, because the audience there were particularly interesting, a huge array of political and royal figures and local nobility and all sorts else. So it was a very noble audience that were well known. So you start looking at their papers and accounts and things, and of course there's so much more there as well. At Chatsworth, I started out thinking there wasn't very much and very quickly found that there was a lot. And through the Chatsworth research, I found records of all these other theatricals taking place at so many other houses and schools and the universities and so on. It just seemed like there was so much untapped material, and that really was what got me started. In the PhD, I wanted to go further and research these other theatricals to see what was going on there, because there were very clear connections between them.
Yeah, you mentioned that there's so much going on in amateur theater at this time that there are almost these genres or subgenres that you have to divide them up into. You talked about a more sort of aristocratic venue such as Chatsworth House, but then there's also all these other kinds of amateur theatricals, including, I think you said, shipboard theatricals?
There's a wide range of amateur theatricals going on in the period. So in the earlier period, so in the late 18th century, you've got these aristocratic theatricals in all sorts of country and town houses. You then start to find amateur theatricals at the universities, although, of course, there's actually a long history of amateur theatricals at the universities that goes back to the Elizabethan times. If you look at amateur theatre, you can go back that far without finding the term amateur to things like the court masques, for example, in the Elizabethan and Jacobean times. But in the 19th century, like you say, there's shipboard theatricals. So a colleague of mine, Sarah Penny, here from the University of Warwick, she's worked on naval theatricals, as well as Mary Isbell, who's is a US scholar. There were some very interesting things going on board ships. Of course, this is an all-male environment, similar to at the schools, similar to at the universities, quite different actually to what's going on in the country houses. There were then military theatricals, so encampments around the UK, sort of volunteer, there were sort of volunteer army groups. They had their own theatricals. Often in the earlier period, it was the officers only, but gradually lower orders were brought in to take part. They gradually included a musical amateur band and so on. It sort of gradually grew and more people were getting involved. These military theatricals also took place abroad. So all over the world, you've got British theatricals taking place in garrisons and encampments all across the British Empire. Quite a bit of work has been done on the Indian theatricals, for example, Simla being one of the places. In the period, you've got amateur clubs and societies that I've already mentioned. These are starting to be set up in the period. And by the end of the period, there's actually a huge amount of amateur clubs and societies that have been established. So it's in the 19th century, in this crucial period that hasn't been researched, that you actually have what we now see as the amateur theatre movement really starting to take a hold. Then you've got these societies are performing in all sorts of interesting places, usually in things like institutes and athenaeums, so quite education-based venues, as well as hiring out town halls, village halls, the professional theatres. In London's West End, some of the theatres that we, now would only really associate with professional theatre, were being used in this time period by amateurs as well. And there's something to be said about the economics of the amateur. One of my chapters is on economics, because I would argue that, in hiring these spaces, they're actually essential to the economy of the theatre more broadly. These are giving a fixed fee to hire the space. It's sort of guaranteed income for them. And from working in the theatre today, I work in an art centre here in the UK, and I know very much that this is still the case now. A hire is very important to us, and those hires actually help to prop up our artistic programme. And I imagine from the research that that's very similar in this time period. As well, you've got what are just termed as the private theatres, which when a little bit more research has been done into them, you find that these private theatres that were mainly in the cities, I've done specific research in London, were actually almost schools of the drama. They were men from the city after work going to these theatres and performing, quite often paying to perform a role. And they were quite lowly institutions. Dickens has sort of written about them quite negatively, but I actually think they've been devalued through the work of Dickens and others, and actually they were quite important to developing professional talent. So in quite a lot of actors' accounts, you find that they actually began in these private theatres in London, which is quite exciting. So I think actually, just as an aside, I think the profession is changing. You're starting to get a different set of people going into the amateur profession from a different social class. These middle class people performing in London are going into these private theatres in the evenings, learning the trade, and then going on into the profession. So I would argue that these private theatres in London are sort of changing the status of the drama, and you've got this new wave of middle class or even high society amateurs coming into the profession as professionals. I mean, they're just a few of the various sorts of amateur theatricals going on, but, you know, to just name a few others, there were the schools that were putting on theatricals: Eton, Harrow, the Westminster School, and so on. The universities both had a struggle to be allowed to perform amateur theatricals along the sort of ordinary lines, farces and melodramas and things like that. But gradually they were allowed to perform. In particular, Cambridge had a long battle to get their society set up, but got there in the end. So yes, all sorts of amateur theatricals going on, and they all seem to have been connected in interesting ways, which I'm sure we'll come on to as well.
Now, this is such a wide range of theatrical activity, all these different kinds of amateur theater that you've been talking about. So I'm sure it's hard to generalize, but I'm curious what it would have been like to attend some of these performances, as well as what you would have seen on the stage. Were they just trying to replicate what they had already seen on the professional stage, or was the repertoire a little different?
That's an interesting question. So in terms of what you're saying about replicating what they've seen on stage, that's particularly interesting, because I was at a conference only at the weekend where we were talking about natural acting, and there was a lot of talk at this time of amateurs being able to act more naturally in certain roles. So these were free from convention. They hadn't been trained in the sort of the school of Garrick, where, you know, it was exclamations on stage and very large gestures, so that in the theatres like Drury Lane and Covent Garden, everyone could see the emotions they were showing, that codified stage. Instead, these amateurs were coming into it, although they may have seen that, they brought their own sort of unique style, perhaps. And, you know, often it's talked about as a natural style of acting. So going back to the other part of your question about what would these performances have been like, well, that, like you say, it's very hard to sort of to pin that down. And each theatrical is unique, and each theatrical form is unique. So I'm here taking a very large, broad topic area of amateur theatricals and trying to avoid generalization. But, I mean, if we take Chatsworth as an example, Chatsworth was an absolute extreme. It was the elite of elite theatricals. And at that extreme, everything about it was special. Before the theatricals took place, there was a buzz of activity around Chatsworth, because the Prince of Wales, who later would become Edward VII, was in the area. So there's records of the whole area being full, the hotels being full with police and with journalists, and with guests of the house and people who just wanted to see what was going on, as well as musicians and dance mistresses and all sorts that were related to the theatricals. So the area was a hub of activity. It was a country house weekend, which in the Edwardian period was all very exciting: shooting, fishing, it was, all the country pursuits taking place. And there was a central house party that was staying in Chatsworth that was usually about 40 people. So there was a lot of excitement around Chatsworth. And on the night of the theatricals, this excitement comes across through all of the press cuttings from it. So you had carriage after carriage arriving at the house. Special trains were put on for the theatrical audience. The house party would process through the various entertainment rooms to the theatre where the guests were waiting. The guests would have come in through different entrances. There was a back entrance for the sort of for the local villagers and such like, and all the sort of nobility and high society guests would have come through the house itself. The theatre was lit with electric light, which I think was quite unique because it was a very small venue. So I argue that actually they were doing something quite interesting in that venue because it was a small space using electric light, whereas the only people at the end of the 19th century, the only other spaces that had electric light for theatricals really were the big London the playhouses. So they were having to change the way they dressed the spaces. So different a different approach to scenery, which looked very different in electric light compared to gas. The costumes would have had to be different because, again, they don't need to be seen by an audience far away. And this sort of natural acting, you're very close up. You don't need those big gestures anymore. So I think, a lot was actually changed in that sort of performance. And there's an account from the stage manager called Leo Trevor, who talks about how the stage makeup specifically had to be changed because on a normal London stage, it was, big red cheeks and sort of white face or whatever else. And here he talks about how it needed to be naturalized for this smaller space and for this more intimate audience. So the chats with theatricals were grand affairs. The press who were invited in to see the production often focus on the audience rather than what's on stage. So in the Illustrated London News and other illustrated newspapers, there's definitely a focus on what was going on in the auditorium rather than on stage, which perhaps might say something about the standard of performances, perhaps not. The focus was on who was there, really. At the other extreme, as I mentioned earlier, you might have something like the private theatres of London, which were attended by not working class people, but middle class men, specifically men, who went there after work. It seems like it was a fairly standard building. There was nothing elaborate or grand about it like there was the West End playhouses. I don't think it quite had a tavern feel, but, it certainly wasn't a classy venue to go to. And, there you've only got men who could perform. The female parts were taken by, professional actresses. So again, coming back to what I said about economics, some actresses made a living from performing alongside men.
Why were professional actresses being brought in to participate in these amateur theatricals?
Very simply, it was that it was less acceptable for women to perform in amateur theatricals, particularly when they had a public nature. So there's some quite extreme accounts of things that families would do to stop their daughters going off to perform in amateur theatricals. One newspaper cutting I have talks about how this daughter really wanted to go off to perform in amateur theatricals and the family really didn't want them to go. So in the end, they threatened her with being sent to an asylum. They would all sign an agreement to say that she was a lunatic, just so that she didn't damage the family reputation by going to perform in amateur theatricals. I think that is probably an extreme, but there certainly was still this association with the women of the stage and prostitution and those sort of things that we still think about in the 18th century. It was not a respectable profession to go into. Also, I think these amateur clubs and societies grew out of the club culture of London, which was male dominated. So the first clubs and societies, the only people that could be members were men. And, there were quite strict sort of rules on who could be brought into the society and who couldn't. They controlled the membership basically. But there were a lot of professional actresses that seemed to have benefited from this system. Going back to the economics, some professional actresses were making a living out of amateur theatre, and some of those became very well-known professional actresses, but also had their status raised through performing in amateur theatricals with these high society gentlemen.
Now, I'm curious, this story that you mentioned about a young woman who's committed to an asylum or threatened to be committed because she wants to go on the stage. You mentioned at one point in a talk, which we'll post with the show notes, that there was almost sort of this backlash against amateur theatricals. They became so popular that there were something that might seem a little bit familiar to anyone who's ever, read anything about the moral panic over video games or pop music today.
Yeah. So there were all sorts of negative attitudes towards amateur theatricals, just like you say, a backlash to sort of similar cultural phenomenons in the 20th or 21st century. So at the time, amateur theatricals were quite novel. They'd started off in high society and were gradually working their way into middle class society and becoming more public. And people thought there were various things that were not good about amateur theatricals. They thought that amateur theatricals encouraged vanity. These were people going on stage, look at me. Some may say that still exists today. They'd say that people, that are involved in amateur theatricals, want to be the center of attention. Maybe it's still the case. There were other aspects. So in these male-dominated environments, and because amateur theatricals at this point were largely the domain of men, they often had to dress up in female characters. And some people really took offense by that convention.
Now, you've talked about some of the links between the amateur theater and the professional one, how some of the economic ways that the professional theater was supported in some ways by the amateur theater. But you also talk about something called, a little bit of an oxymoron here, the professional amateur, who arguably included, among others, Charles Dickens, whom you mentioned earlier. Who were these professional amateurs, and why do you use that term?
Okay. Yes, the professional amateurs have been one of the real discoveries from this research that I have become almost obsessed with sort of following the leads. So when I started the Chatsworth research, there was already this sense of the professional amateur. But let me tell you about one collection which really brought this concept to life. There's a company that started in 1842, an amateur company called the Canterbury Old Stagers, and their collection exists in Canterbury Cathedral archives. And when I went along to that collection, I was absolutely amazed. This collection not only was set up to document the goings on of the Canterbury Old Stagers, but the members were also encouraged to include in the scrapbooks of the society programs and playbills and tickets and all sorts of other ephemera, newspaper cuttings and so on, relating to their theatricals beyond Canterbury. So what this collection started to reveal, page after page, when you're looking through the scrapbooks, was that there was a huge interconnected world of amateur theatre in the 19th century that these aristocratic or high society amateurs were involved in. So whereas today we largely think of amateur theatre as being quite localized, and you might become a local celebrity in amateur theatre and people know you for performing in your local theatre. Here we're talking about celebrities, amateur celebrities, that were known across the country. So taking one of the performers, a gentleman called Quintin Twiss, who was son of Horace Twiss. He seems to have been performing all over the place in country house theatricals, in the universities, and so on. And if you look at these individual characters, they link up all of these different sort of forms of amateur theatre that I've already talked about. You know, quite often they perform in private theatricals at home. They'd go on and perform at school as well as in the universities. Then they'd come out and then join the Canterbury Old Stagers, maybe join a similar society called the Windsor Strollers, who were also well known. They'd perform with garrisons. They were almost drafted in. I think in some cases they had connections to people and went and performed at these places. In other cases they were written to and asked, will you come and perform at such and such? And a guy called Alec Tassell, who was one of the amateurs, there's a letter, or actually I think it might be in his obituary, and it says that he was regularly approached to perform in amateur theatricals. So there's this amazing network. And you mentioned Charles Dickens, because literary scholars have worked on Dickens and his theatricals and have sort of held them up as some sort of unique amateur theatrical experience or something unique that was going on. Whereas actually this research that actually looks at amateur theatre more broadly very clearly places the Dickens theatricals in that context. It shows them not to be as unique as you'd think. So these professional amateurs would quite often perform a piece and then take it around. They'd tour it. So you'd find the same piece with the same cast going from country house to country house, appearing for a charity theatrical in London. You know, it really is quite amazing that they were almost touring companies. And Charles Dickens is one of those professional amateurs in my eyes, actually. And that might be a new spin on Dickens. You know, if something hasn't been done in Dickens scholarship, it might be looking at him as a professional amateur.
Did anyone ever make the leap from being a so-called professional amateur to just a professional full stop?
Yeah, absolutely. And this goes back to what I was saying about perhaps that through the birth of amateur theatre, it was a new route into the profession. So you've got people that start off in amateur theatricals, in things like the private theatres, that then end up going on into the profession. And there's numerous names, big names from 19th century theatre that made that route. Some of these professional amateurs did make the leap, but often took the step back again. There seems to almost have been, I think there was more of a fluidity between the boundary of professional and amateur. You know, some people could go between them. These high society individuals more often than not remained on the side of the amateur. Again, going back to Leo Trevor, I recently went back and looked at his work on country house theatricals, and he talks about how some of the amateurs, these professional amateurs, went on to the profession, and others stayed on the side of the angels, suggesting that it was the better side to stay on. And I think actually it was, because an example of someone that made that journey is a gentleman called Lord Rosslyn, who I think it was 1900, went onto the stage as a professional. He basically almost bankrupted himself, spent the family fortune, and needed to take on a profession. And he says that was what was almost most appealing to him. He thought he would be best at. He was in elite social circles at that time. Edward VII and his set were very close to Lord Rosslyn. And in his autobiography, he says, and in his memoirs, he says that very quickly from taking that leap to the professional stage, he was shunned from those circles. And within a few years, he'd left the stage profession and gone back to do other things. So it's interesting because we sort of think that the gender boundary, we think that women had it hard with amateur theatricals, but actually these high society men really couldn't take that leap either if they wanted to keep their social status.
Now, you've mentioned the work of a number of really accomplished scholars who have been working on this subject, but I think it's fair to say that the subject has still been relatively neglected. Why do you think that's the case, and why is studying it so important for our understanding of theater's history and its role in society?
I think it's been neglected because the stereotype of the amateur, which existed even in the early 19th century, that stereotype of the vanity we've already talked about, and all those other things that you associate with amateurs, the middle-class diva, and so on. They're there at the start of the 19th century. There were a group who were set up in 1802 called the Picnic Society, and they were ridiculed for a good year before they abandoned that society, because they were just completely ridiculed in the press. Caricatures were here, there, and everywhere of them. And that same stereotype still exists today. One of the other reasons, I think, is something that Claire Cochrane, who is a scholar who's written on amateur theatricals, something that she's talked about, which is, I think a professional academic doesn't want to be associated with amateur theatre. It just doesn't work. So I think that is possibly one of the reasons. I've got colleagues that are working on wonderful things, Shakespeare and all these wonderful highbrow things. And here we are with the cultural hierarchy, which puts amateur far lower than those. So, when I tell people about my research, they sort of, it's not valued. And I think it's a problem that amateur theatre isn't valued, actually. We don't give enough value to amateur theatre even today. And I think that is starting to change. Helen Nicholson, who is another scholar that's worked on amateur theatre more recently, has written about the amateur turn, which is here in the 21st century, and talks about how the economics of our country have affected our attitude to amateur theatricals, voluntary work, and that sort of thing. So that could be a reason for it as well. Why is it important? Well, from my perspective, I've been amazed by some of the findings that have come out of this. And I can't wait to get it out published, because there's so much there that has just been totally untapped. And we've seen the professional sphere as separate from the amateur sphere. Whereas actually when you do this research, you realize how intertwined the amateur and the professional really were throughout this period. And, I argue that they were symbiotic. There's all sorts of relationships between the two. You've got the amateurs and professionals mingling at social occasions, at all sorts of social functions, balls and banquets and, that sort of thing, as well as meeting in social environments like the Garrett Club and other London-based clubs.
We'll post a link to an article on David's research, as well as video of a lecture that he gave on the subject earlier this year. David, thanks for sharing your research on amateur theatricals with us.
Thank you for having me, and thanks for listening. I really do love sharing my research with other people. So thanks for asking me to do this interview.
If you'd like to continue today's conversation, please visit howlround.com and follow HowlRound and @TheaterHistory on Twitter and Facebook. You can also visit our website at theaterhistorypodcast.net, where you can find links to all of our episodes. And you can email your questions and comments about the show to theaterhistory@theaterhistorypodcast.net. A big thank you to the staff at HowlRound who make this show possible. Our theme music is The Black Crook Gallop, which comes to us courtesy of the New York Public Library Libretto Project and Adam Roberts. Thanks as well to Tip Kress, who designed our logo. And finally, thank you for listening.